We're going to invest $1.7 trillion in securing our future so that by 2050, the United States will be 100% clean energy economy.
Biden announced a new Green Deal and issued restrictions on fossil fuel supplies. This will make America more dependent on solar energy. But companies from which country will supply those solar panels?
China Inc. controls 80 to 90% of the market.
And who is funding China's renewable energy industry?
So this company is not a private enterprise, but an institution controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
So what implications does a Chinese Communist Party-controlled solar industry mean to America's energy independence and national security?
That means we lose our energy independence. That also means we'll be totally dependent on China for the majority of our clean energy. And if we do nothing, it's scary.
Hello and welcome to Zoom In China. I'm Simone Gao. A consortium of renewable energy CEOs have asked President Joe Biden to remove tariffs that the Trump administration had issued on imported solar panels. They argue that the tariffs are an obstacle to the renewable energy industry's ability to tackle climate change. On March 1st, the Biden administration decided to stand behind Trump's policy. The new administration asked the court to dismiss a complaint from some members of the solar industry arguing that President Trump's tariffs were unlawful. However, the bigger question is where the new Green Deal policy of the Biden administration will lead America. How is it going to affect America's energy independence? And if America becomes less energy independent, who will America rely on for solar energy, and what will be the consequence of that reliance? In this episode of Zooming In, we'll explore these questions. The current tariff imposes an 18% tax on solar cells made outside of the United States, most of which are imported from China. Those cells are assembled into panels and sold by many American companies. Biden has announced ambitious goals for curbing global warming. In his first few days in office, the president canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, rejoined the Paris Accord, and called for a $2 trillion new Green Deal. Solar energy will play a huge role in this initiative. It already accounts for more than 12% of all renewable energy in the United States, and is expected to account for 1/2 of all green energy by 2050. But there is a catch. The global supply chain for solar panels is dominated by Chinese firms, and most of the solar panels sold in this country use imported components. This poses a strategic risk for the United States if it becomes too dependent on its rival for energy. First, let's look at how China obtained its quasi-monopoly of the world's solar energy industry in the first place. How did a country known for its lax environmental regulations and pollution become such a key player in renewable energy? China's solar energy industry originated in the 1990s as an export-oriented industry designed to meet the demands of European countries. Countries like Germany and Italy had passed legislation to encourage the use of solar energy, and domestic manufacturers couldn't keep up. This was instead outsourced to Chinese suppliers. Since then, the industry has grown precipitously, and China has become the undisputed world leader in solar technology. LONGi Technology is the largest solar company in the world, and is responsible for manufacturing 25% of all silicon wafers across the globe. But LONGi isn't alone. Collectively, the Chinese solar industry accounts for at least 60% of global capacity in every stage of the supply chain, producing more than 66% of polysilicon and nearly 80% of solar cells. On the other hand, companies from across the world wanted to enter this field as renewable energy was becoming more lucrative. But it's difficult to survive in this industry. Since 2011, more than 750 solar companies have liquidated or closed, most notably Solyndra, which was backed by the Obama administration. In 2020, the Trump administration was still recovering parts of a $425 million loan that had been granted to a solar company during the Obama years. The failed project, called Crescent Dunes, used thousands of mirrors in the Nevada desert to heat up steam in a giant tower and had cost more than $1.1 billion in total. The solar industry is an inherently risky enterprise that requires enormous investment across many years, as production aren't cost efficient until the project reaches a large scale. Rapid technological changes means that hundreds of millions can go up in smokes as yesterday's innovation becomes obsolete. That said, how did the Chinese companies manage to outperform their competitors globally? I asked the former Undersecretary of State for the Trump administration, Keith Krach, this question. Mr. Krach was responsible for economic growth, energy, and environment during the last administration. Thank you, Mr. Krach, for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Simone. I appreciate being here.
Okay, so it seems that solar cell manufacturing is not an easy business. Most of the startups don't make it, and there's a constant flux of companies going out of business. What is the biggest reason for that?
No, you're right, Simone. 250 firms that have entered the PV industry globally, and there's been 150 that have exited. And the bloodletting is worse if you look at second and third generation technologies like thin film. 27 of the 34 startups went belly up. And the reason is simple. China Inc. has come to dominate the solar cell manufacturing business. And it's been through a 20-year set of systematic, non-market state policies, which include subsidies, forced labor, state financing, IP theft, and then also unlimited amounts of capital, thanks to the government policy. And then also you have buying up companies like U.S. companies that have been weakened by this strategy. And free countries' companies operate according to free market principles. And the Chinese state-led companies don't. There's not a level playing field.
China's domination in the renewable energy market presents another problem for the U.S., given the difficulty in manufacturing effective solar technology. If a nation loses its competitive edge in the field, it may lose it forever. And an illustration example is the story of America's decline in telecommunications technology. In 2019, Trump banned U.S. companies from using communication technology that poses a national security risk, which included 5G networks produced by the Chinese tech giant Huawei. The FBI and the intelligence agencies warned that the company has ties to the Chinese Communist Party and their products could serve to spy on their customers. After the ban, U.S. companies shifted their reliance on European companies like Nokia and Ericsson. The rollover Huawei raised an embarrassing question. Why couldn't the U.S. produce its own 5G network? In the second half of the 20th century, the United States was a leader in telecommunication technology, and in 1999, Lucent was the sixth largest U.S. company in market capitalization. In the 1980s and the 1990s, China's IT industry was still primitive and was reliant on imported technology. However, state regulators required foreign companies to share their trade secret with local firms if they wanted access to the Chinese market, and companies like Lucent agreed to sharing. At the time, they didn't see China IT industry as a threat, but starting in 2002, Huawei and others started to muscle their way into the US market, while Lucent still struggled to gain an even footing after the dot-com bubble burst. U.S. telecom equipment imports rose from $71 to $129 billion between 2000 and 2008, while Chinese exports rose from $19 to $124 billion around the same time frame. By then, Lucent had been sold to a French company, and Nortel, which was once Lucent's biggest American rival, had gone bankrupt. There are some industries that can be conjured up overnight, and a year and a half after Trump's ban on Huawei, there is no end in near sight for America's reliance on imported 5G equipment. What has happened to America's telecom companies could also happen to its solar industry. It's arguably already halfway there. While solar cells might not pose the same cybersecurity risks as 5G networks, there remains the threat that China might choose to embargo the United States over a diplomatic dispute. Samantha Sloan, vice president of First Solar, said this to Politico in an interview. Solar panels are the next crude oil, and allowing China to dominate solar manufacturing is the equivalent of establishing an electoral state on the lines of OPEC. In 1973, the OPEC embargo caused the oil prices in America to quadruple, which led to a severe recession. I asked Mr. Kroc what it means if China dominated the solar energy industry. China is on track to gain a monopoly on manufacturing solar panel cells. So do you think in the future there is a possibility that the U.S. will be dependent on Chinese solar energy and supplies? And if that happens, what it will mean to America?
Well, Simone, they basically are already a monopoly in this business. China Inc. controls 80 to 90% of the market. All top 10 companies are Chinese, except for First Solar in the U.S., which has 2% market share, and a Korean firm that has about 5% market share. And the Chinese manufacturers have diversified some production within Asia to avoid things like tariffs, but Chinese factories still produce 60% of the world's PV cells. And that means we lose our energy independence. And, for good reason, because necessary climate technologies like solar could account for 70% of our energy needs by 2050. But that also means we'll be totally dependent on China for the majority of our clean energy. And if we do nothing, it's scary.
Right. You just said the U.S. still has a tiny industry that produces solar energy components. Do you think they can effectively compete with the Chinese manufacturers in the coming years?
Well, there's three big problems with the status quo. What's happened is it makes it very expensive to finance because of China Inc.'s subsidiaries. And it's whether they're flowing or just serving as a backstop. And this will make investors seek higher returns as compensation for that increased risk. It's also stifled competition. And given the climate challenge, PV is too important a technology to fail. And there's a real chance that the industry system of innovation will not be able to meet the challenge. PV solar appears to function much more as a barrier than a bridge for next generation technologies to gain a foothold and to establish, what's really important is experience curves and economies of scale. And then finally, China Inc. strategically owns the beginning of the supply chain, particularly polysilicon. And the vast majority of it is produced in Xinjiang.
Talking about Xinjiang, its official name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China. It's the largest province-level division of the country and is home to a number of ethnic minority groups. Reports from the World Uyghur Congress submitted to the UN in 2018 suggest that 1 million Uyghurs are currently being held in the re-education camps in Xinjiang. Officials from both the Trump and Biden administration have declared that genocide has been happening in Xinjiang. So, where is Xinjiang in China's green energy production landscape? And who is really running China's green industry? Today, when we talk about China's renewable energy industry, we cannot skip the Golden Concord Holdings Limited, or GCL Group, a conglomerate that specializes in renewable energy. GCL Group ranked number 3 in the 2017 list of top 500 global new energy enterprises. On the surface, GCL is a privately owned company, but it actually has deep ties with the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army of China. On its website, it says, dating from 1990, GCL has been following the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, and leading green growth with the red genes. In the organization, there are 12 CCP committees, 5 CCP branch committees, 120 CCP divisions, and 3,000 CCP members. Zhu Gongshan, chairman of the company, also serves as a member of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a central part of the party's United Front system. In 2011, by partnering with the Poly Group, GCL Poly became the world's largest polysilicon manufacturer. The Xinjiang base is its new production center and is planned to have an annual output of 100,000 tons of high-purity polysilicon, the largest in the country. By October 2019, it already had a 60,000-ton polysilicon production capacity. The cost of producing polysilicon in that facility fell below 40,000 yuan, or around $6,000 per ton.
There are two reasons why Xinjiang has become a manufacturing base. We know this industry consumes a lot of energy. It may take 3 years for a solar panel to generate the energy that was consumed by its production. And Xinjiang Zhundong has the largest coal mine in China so far. Just this Zhundong coal mine contains 7% of the whole country's coal reserves. It can also provide high calorific value coals by open-pit coal mining. This can tremendously cut the production cost of solar panels. Secondly, the labor cost in Xinjiang is also very low. The average salary may be just a half or a third of that in Shanghai. It's about $700 a month in Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang. Workers in the United States or Europe just cannot compete.
This is what Mr. Krok thinks about Xinjiang's facility. Talking about Xinjiang, we know that Xinjiang has become the biggest manufacturing base for polysilicon, and there are many reasons for that. But two important reasons are: one, there happened to be a big coal mine near the facility, so they get cheap coal. They get cheap coals to produce polysilicon, and two, Xinjiang's labor is very cheap. We now know that Xinjiang's cotton production uses concentration camp laborers. We don't know if that's the case with the polysilicon production. But do you think the world should be concerned about these factors?
Well, you have your facts right, Simone, and this is troubling for a number of reasons. And I would really turn the question around and ask, what does this mean for freedom, for human rights, and for environmental protection? And considering that Xinjiang represents probably about 65% of China's solar manufacturing capacity. And in 2016, only 9% of the world's solar-grade polysilicon came from Xinjiang. But by 2020, it provided about 45% of the world's supply. And the media has reported on the forced labor population with about 13 million Muslim minorities, including the Uyghurs. Secretary of State Blinken has reinforced Secretary Pompeo's labeling of the treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide. I just wrote an op-ed about that in Newsweek, and this is punishable genocide. And we all want to take action on climate change. However, we also have to remain true to our values and stand up for human rights. And everybody likes cheap goods and services. Yet there have been multiple times when free nations and consumers decided that the relative savings or corporate profit was outweighed by the cost of society. And I just ask you to consider the case of blood diamonds. And as Supreme Court Justice Brandeis noted, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the public will turn away from Chinese solar if there's greater transparency. And the U.S. was a leader in fostering the solar industry. And we can resume that role, and we'll play competitive once we ensure a level playing field.
Now let's go back to the GCL group. It has close ties not only to the party, but to the military as well. In 2020, GCL partnered with the Poly Group again. By receiving Poly Investments' gigantic funding, the two entities were set to pioneer cutting-edge photovoltaic and semiconductor technology. Who is behind Poly Group, you might wonder?
China Poly Group is among the 102 biggest central state-owned enterprises in China, It was set up on the basis of Polytechnology Incorporation, an arms manufacturing wing of the People's Liberation Army of China. Now it is primarily engaged in representing the Chinese defense manufacturing industry in international sales. Later, Poly Group was founded on top of Polytechnologies Incorporation. The two founders were Wang Jun and He Ping. Wang Jun was the second son of Wang Zhen, who was a founding general of PRC and was vice premier and vice president in China. He Ping's father-in-law is Deng Xiaoping. So this company is not a private enterprise, but an institution controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
President Biden wants to reduce the consumption of traditional energy sources that come from fossil fuels and has issued restrictions on things like fracking and the Keystone XL oil pipeline. In the future, if the U.S. is dependent on Chinese solar energy and the Communist Party decides to embargo America, what will happen? Here's Keith Krach again. Do you think America's existing strategic energy reserves are enough to counter a serious major energy embargo?
It's a good question. And many wars have been lost and won because of oil. As Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, I looked at those three responsibilities as an optimization equation that maximize national security by optimizing economic growth, energy security, and the health of the planet. And this is a delicate balance to ensure our grandchildren can enjoy the same prosperity and freedoms that we have. And we can't lose sight of that. In terms of strategic energy reserves, it only lasts so long. So the big question is getting that delicate balance and optimizing that. And that requires a lot of analytical thinking and a lot of analysis.
So what should be the plan going forward?
Well, I think government does have a role to play in ensuring clarity and to allow free enterprise to flourish. Increased public investment in R&D is absolutely essential. I'm a free trader, and I believe in America's free market system is the best in the world. But when somebody comes into the market and doesn't play by the rules, the market is no longer free. And, as I said in my Senate confirmation hearing, when I was asked about my strategy and what it would be dealing with the China challenge, I said it would entail harnessing three of America's biggest comparative advantages. And the first, uniting and mobilizing our allies. The second is leveraging the innovation and resources of our private sector. And the third is amplifying our democratic values. And when we do that, China cannot compete. And I believe strongly in the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit of the American private sector. However, the U.S. government, along with other free nations, have really got to ensure that there's an opportunity to compete. And we believe in and enforce transparency, human rights, and environmental standards. And free nations must demand that the energy transition is not done on the backs of minority populations in Xinjiang, where there's genocide going on. And policymakers, we've got to adopt measures that counter China's policies, just like we did with the Clean Network in 5G. And we've got to raise the odds that the alternatives to the dominant design in PV and other key climate and clean energy technologies get a fair chance. And this is important to succeed, in the coming decade. And innovation and deployment of those technologies are both important goals for public policy.
Do you think the Biden administration will go on this path?
I think everybody understands the importance of energy security and how that's tied with national security. But here again, it's an optimization equation in terms of maximizing national security, which is the North Star for the federal government, by optimizing economic growth, energy security, and the health of the planet. All three of those are critical for our future.
As the Biden administration presses forward with its green energy policy, it will have to deal with the dilemma of increased reliance on China-sourced solar components. Demands for solar energy will only increase if fossil fuel faces more restrictions. Although U.S. solar cell manufacturers do exist, they are responsible for a minority of the solar panel market in America. Whether the industry can survive and thrive will remain a critical strategic issue for America and the world in the coming decades. Thanks for watching Zooming in China. Please don't forget to subscribe to this new channel. I'm Simone Gao, and I'll see you next time.